Founders, and I'm a student success coach here at Boise State. And it is my privilege to introduce today's webinar topic, From Unicorn to Zombie, What We Can Learn from WeWork's Demise. The reason that I get to introduce our panel today is that I work closely with our students pursuing our fully online BBA management program, as well as our business certificate programs. And we thought that there might be some crossover interest with our audience today. This group may be particularly interested in our new business creation certificate, which we're launching this fall. It's designed for developing entrepreneurs, so pretty relevant for today, but a little bit more on that later. Boise State is, of course, a place where we really value discussion and exchange, and we're really excited that you decided to join us to discuss this topic with some of our faculty and business community leaders. For those of you who haven't read about the company or seen the Hulu documentary WeWork, or the making and breaking of a $47 billion unicorn, I'm going to like to provide a little bit of recap and context for you. The documentary focuses, of course, on WeWork, the somewhat utopian communal working/living/learning startup founded by Adam Neumann. Neumann, a young, tall, charismatic entrepreneur, developed and pitched an idea for his new venture targeting other millennial startups. Essentially, the idea was to refurbish New York office spaces into bright, attractive, hip locations full of plucky entrepreneurs hungry for networking opportunities. Sort of take the idea of these sexy Silicon Valley campuses and then make them more communal and spread them all over the world. The idea went further, though. As one reporter put it, this was during a period where you were rewarded if you could articulate a vision of your company that wasn't just going to make money, but was also going to change the world. Adam Neumann effectively leveraged this idea and the cult of his own personality to get tremendous buy-in from his employers, tenants, and investors alike, leading to absolutely explosive growth within a single decade. Come to find out, everything was not as it seemed. With some financial engineering and dishonesty, as well as buy-in from the enormously influential investment group SoftBank, WeWork's valuation reached a staggering high of $47 billion by January 2019, less than 10 years after its inception. In reality, however, the quote, physical social network was hemorrhaging cash at an alarming rate. When plans for further investment by SoftBank fell through leading up to WeWork's IPO, everything sort of collapsed. WeWork's valuation plummeted to the single-digit billions, and Neumann was voted out, though not without becoming very rich in the process. WeWork provides a really fascinating case study and jumping off point for our panel to discuss a kind of ultra exploitive capitalism that replaces ethical business practices with flash and idealism. And we are really fortunate to have a panel of experts with us today, ready to unpack what went wrong and sort of help us figure out how we can avoid these mistakes ourselves as entrepreneurs. So with that, I would like to introduce our fantastic panel. First up, we have Stephen Hyde, who is an assistant professor of management at Boise State, where he teaches corporate strategy. Stephen received his PhD in management from the University of Texas at San Antonio, and his research focuses on topics related to executives, corporate governance, unethical behavior, and deception, all very relevant. Thank you for being here today, Stephen. Next up, we have Jess Cooper Whiting. Jess has launched 5 different organizations, consulted and mentored numerous venture-backed organizations, primarily in Boise and the Silicon Valley. Locally, she helped revitalize the startup ecosystem, led the startup community, and brought in top global investors. She helped startups here in the Treasure Valley quietly raise millions of dollars, leading to successful exits. Jess specializes in AR, VR, autonomous systems, tech, and crypto. Most recently, her efforts are global, matching hundreds of the best global startups to top strategic Silicon Valley investors. She and her husband are also working on a predictive model for scaling startups to assist VCs and CEOs. Also incredibly relevant today. Thank you so much for joining us, Jess. Third, we have Ian Bellet, who has successfully launched 5 companies, validating his expertise in business development and partner channels. His leadership extends to his role as an adjunct professor of marketing, customer service, and entrepreneurship. Ian provides executive leadership through a CRO level role that involves forward-thinking strategy and collaboration with the company's executive leadership. He also develops accurate models to shape holistic revenue strategies and execute tactical initiatives across the sales, marketing, and partner management departments. Thank you for joining us today, Ian. And last but certainly not least, we have our moderator, Karen Nicholas. Karen is an assistant professor of management and currently teaches in the areas of strategy, innovation, and change management here at Boise State. Her research focuses on the influence of status on organizations. For example, how the quest to become a unicorn or to be an investor in one might lead to less than logical decisions. Just before we get started, I want to let you all know that you can post your questions in the chat at any time, and we're going to do our best to curate those and get them to the panel. Thank you so much for being here, all of you. And Karen, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tim. I see some familiar names and faces, at least some of them in our attendees. So way to go, those of you current or very soon to be current students in the program for coming. One other thing is there are, if you haven't noticed already, a lot of acronyms and a lot of terms. So far I've heard VC, IPO, CRO, all sorts of things. So please, any acronym that you're not aware of, or any term, it doesn't have to be an acronym, pop it in the chat. Catherine's going to help us in the back end by giving definitions for some of these terms. In every line of work, there's a language. And there certainly is with investors, and it's pretty interesting. We're going to try and define the terms as we go. So the first term I'd like to define is unicorn. What the heck is a unicorn? And I had briefly warned Jessica that I was going to put her on the spot for this. So Jessica, let's have a little chat. What's a unicorn?
You bet. So unicorn was coined back when Aileen Lee, who was the founder of Cowboy Ventures, had written an article, I think it was in TechCrunch, that talked about, hey, join the unicorn club because it is so rare to find unicorns. And so it was just a few years ago. She is awesome. She is invested in some herself. And it really is when these companies and startups hit the $1 million or the $1 billion valuation, which is pretty rare. I think there's like 3 in every 5 million startups hit that number. So it is rare. It's rare like a unicorn. So I think it's a great name.
It is interesting. Now, just a unicorn doesn't necessarily have $1 billion in their bank. It's the valuation of the firm. It's relatively clear math. Can you just walk us through that?
Yeah, well, clear and not clear, because as we'll learn today, it's going to be shady. You're going to find some different analysis. In fact, there are different ways you can value a company. And when we look at startups, there are several different methods. You can do like a 1 to 3x on a revenue. So sometimes if you're fundraising as a startup, you can go and look at that way. A lot of times they'll look at EBITDA and they'll do like 3 to 6 of your EBITDA over there. You can look at net income. A lot of times you'll run comps. Oh, yes.
EBITDA?
Yeah.
Earnings before interest, taxes, appreciation. And I think I missed a D, didn't I?
Depreciation.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was good. So that's another one that we find a lot of times with investors will use. Really, you can do the DCF model, which is the discounted cash flows, and looking at future potential and then finding out what the current model is for today. And then I think what I tend to see more often is that we'll look at comps. So you're going to look at people that are also your high competitors. What are they valued at? What is the potential that your company is going to make and be? And that's where the story comes in. I mean, if you can sell a really good story, you can do it. Now, the one thing, if any of you guys out there are fundraising or want to start a startup, when you talk about valuation, just make sure you're talking either pre-money valuation or post-money. Just make sure that you clarify that as you're fundraising.
Oh, what does that mean?
Well, if you're going to raise like $1 million at a pre-money valuation, let's say you're saying, hey, I want to raising money at $1 million at $3 million valuation. You want to make sure, is that post-money? Because that means you're really worth $2 million pre-money before the money comes in, that $1 million, or you're $3 million, the money comes in and now you're $4 million. So how much you're valued and how much your equity owns will determine. So I just see that common. Just make sure you're using pre or post so that you know exactly how much your equity is worth.
So if we did a very simple model, and I'm going to come down from the millions, if I think my company is worth $50,000 and I'm going to offer you a share in it, if I say, hey, are you willing to give me $10,000 for 20% of it? if I do the math, I am valuing it at $50,000, right? And if you're willing to, you agree with my valuation.
Yeah.
If we think of Shark Tank, they do that a fair bit. They'll say, no, I'll give you 5,000 for 10%. Wait, 5,000 for 20%. And I'm valuing you at 25,000. So a lot of it is just some fun math as to how much you can convince others that you're worth. So that's the idea of a unicorn, right? Somehow, some way, someone's agreed that they're worth $1 billion. And it's kind of interesting. So WeWork went totally sideways. It went upside down. One of the questions I was going to start with was, who was harmed by the WeWork fiasco? This might have been a better follow-on question. And I put Jessica on the spot already, so I was going to see if I could either hook Stephen or Ian. If you want to talk about, who do you feel got hurt by the WeWork fiasco?
So I think their employees definitely got hurt by that fiasco for a lot of different reasons that maybe have nothing to do with valuations at all, but more with leadership than anything else, and the culture of the company. I think they were the number one group that was harmed more than anyone else. I mean, clearly, the owner, he came out great. He ended up owning his own buildings. He's very well off. He's never got anything to worry about for the rest of his life, and which is, happens quite a bit, to be honest, in that world. So I don't think, like, you could say the investors got hurt, although I think investors tend to invest with the idea that they've got a 4 in 5 chance of losing money. If they're not doing that, they're kind of naive. So and the fund that invested in WeWork is doing great these days. They've completely rebounded and they're better than they ever were. So it really comes down to people when it comes to harm.
It's interesting when you say that they're doing better than ever. I read an article that said they were hoping to be in the black. Now, they might have already hit that, because I think I was reading one that was a couple months old. Are they in the black now?
You talking about WeWork itself?
Yes.
No, WeWork itself, that I don't know a lot about, although I did a little bit of research on WeWork, and they definitely are still a viable organization. They still have a lot of locations all over the world. They're still running their business, and I think they probably have a decent chance of getting into the black and being a healthy company. So were they hurt in the short term? Yeah, for sure.
Now, Stephen, from your perspective, what do you think the key issue was that led to their downfall? And it's an interesting downfall, but.
Yeah, I mean, I could probably talk for a long time about all the different things that went wrong. It's kind of a perfect storm of kind of like everything wrong in corporate America just kind of happened in this one spot. But to briefly summarize, the first problem is you have a narcissistic, charismatic leader who's like surrounded by yes men, right? He has no one to stop him, no one to tell him no. I mean, just look at, so the S1 documents is a document you give out before you do your IPO. There were all kinds of red flags in there that if anyone had half a brain should have noticed, right? So like, for example, he trademarked the word we and was going to sell it back to WeWork. And then he owned buildings too that he was leasing out to WeWork. So like anyone with half a brain would have like looked at this and said, that's a problem. Investors are going to react negatively. Journalists are going to notice that and react negatively. But apparently that didn't happen, right? Because it was still in the S1 document. So either no one had the courage to speak up or no one noticed. All of those are equally bad. So he has a team of people who either won't tell him anything or he won't listen to any negative feedback. Second,
so just hang on 1 second there, just to explain. So if I own my own company and I decide I want it to be traded on the stock exchange, Thank you, Catherine. I see the chat coming up. You put out a prospectus document, and it's this big, massive document that says, here's why we're going public, here's how great we are, here's how wonderful we are. What Stephen's pointing out is that someone should have looked at the document before it was put out for public consumption and gone, maybe those things shouldn't have been in there, which is a very interesting challenge. Okay, Stephen, sorry, and thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it reflects the lack of discipline around him. There's no one who's being a cop. There's no police officer that is around, or no like CFO who's paying attention, right? He's just letting him do whatever he wants. Then we have an investor who encouraged that, right? He even said, go crazy, gives him more money. And really, Adam Newman is like the worst person you want to say, go crazy and do more. This is a guy thinks he's boy genius, and thinks he could like cure or prevent all war, right? Like if you look up some quotes he said, it's insane. So your investor gives him money, encourages that behavior, and then buys so much into this vision that Adam argues for that he ignores the fundamentals. He ignores really what this value should be and boost the valuation of this company. Now, Mr. Song, the leader or the founder of SoftBank, he's a really huge investor, legendary. I mean, his investment in Alibaba was arguably the most successful investment ever. It went from like 200 or 20 million to $100 billion, right? So when he's investing in this company, that gives this company so much cachet and makes other investors feel like they're missing out. So now they all want to invest more, shooting that evaluation up even more, which is a problem because it shouldn't be. And then we have a systematic failure of governance, corporate governance across every single level. So the board, no one's reining him in. Analysts at like Wells Fargo are saying this is a good company, so they're not paying attention to the finances either and the foundation of what's going on. And then you even have audit, right? The audit of Ernst & Young missed this whole thing. So it's a failure of governance across every single level. So it's really just a perfect storm of like, yeah, this is everything that's bad within America, or like corporate America right now, like a perfect storm of all of these issues.
How about Jessica and Ian? Would you have any points to add to that? It's a fairly chunky list, but how do you feel about what happened at WeWork?
I love that Stephen brought up the S1, because I was going through the S1 and I am not an IPO expert, but holy cats, I think anyone on here can see all the red flags. You don't have to be an IPO expert. Like he was saying, he's like making millions off owning these businesses and renting them back. I mean, he owned the trademark for We, just like that trademark alone, he was making 6 million off WeWork coming back on the trademark. His wife was set to decide who the successor of the company would be if he were incapable or died. She's on the board. I mean, there were so many, like how many red flags? We need like a buzzer. If we just went through the list and like we all hit a buzzer every time there's a red flag of like, they didn't hide things very well, which is great because all the investors could all of a sudden see these are major problems, And I just thought it was just wild. Like even Adam's voting rights, he had 20 votes per share of stock that he owned, which is more than double what most CEOs even have. So, I mean, just going down the list, they were losing money as you start to look into it, like Stephen was alluding to. I mean, it was like they were just losing. And we're talking hundreds of millions. And I think even into the billions when they got to 2018, I was looking at some numbers and I thought, this is so painful. Who's doing the corporate governance? Who's looking into this stuff and there's no truth sayers inside this company.
The cult of personality is very strong and very attractive. And we were talking about this last week. We got together and had a little chat. And the other company being Theranos, which was we can take a drop of blood and analyze everything. And it's completely smoke and mirrors. Ian, would you like to jump in?
Yeah. So, I always tend to look at how things are supposed to work and how they're being executed upon, right? So I think the most informative part of the documentary for me was that whole discussion about what's a cappuccino and what's a latte. If you guys have watched it, you'll know what I'm talking about. But a reporter and Adam went to the barista and ordered a latte and a cappuccino, and the reporter knew what he ordered. Apparently, Adam thought a latte was a cappuccino. And what's really interesting about it is none of his employees had ever corrected him. They never had the courage to tell him a simple fact. It's like, Adam, yeah, that's actually called a latte, not a cappuccino, dude. Maybe, maybe you should understand that. And that tells me that he's not getting enough feedback, period. And when you look at what makes a business successful, is you've got to understand there's all these elements, right? There's marketing, there's processes, there's operations, there's finance. Nobody in the world is an expert at all that stuff. And if everything is going through one brain without any kind of advice or feedback coming into that brain, it's a recipe for disaster. So that's kind of how I see what was going on there. I don't think there was any leadership there that was strong enough where they were able to give Adam the kind of advice that he needed. And I don't think he was probably not willing to listen to it, even if they did. So that business is never, in my opinion, that business is never going to work.
With that force. So I think I just put in the link to the S1 if anybody wants to find it. If anyone wants to click on it and look at the information. So we're talking about WeWork, we're talking about the unicorns. So one of our goals is how to avoid this from happening. And Stephen, this is right up your alley and your line of research. So I'm going to lob this one over to you. So how can we avoid this happening in the future? You've given some hints.
So you can't surround yourself. The first thing, you can't surround yourself with yes men. You have to have people in the top management team and your board who will actually give you real feedback. If everyone's just agreeing with what you're saying and supporting everything you're saying, it's a problem. In general, I think our business society has focused. So I'm going to talk about board because I think the board is really key here.
So who should the board be made of? Let's just talk about a board of directors, because unless our attendees are working for public companies and have a good understanding, it might be a bit nebulous.
Yeah, so the board of directors are people who represent the shareholders. And so they are supposed to be working in the best interest of the shareholders. Now, most of the time, and I think that most of the emphasis that's been put on the board has been advising strategy and helping the CEO come up with the best strategies, which is important. But overall, our society has ignored another really equally, if not more important aspect of their role, which is to monitor, to make sure the firm isn't acting unethically, to make sure the firm isn't being deceptive. Our focus has primarily been on how can these board members provide value for us? How can they give me new networks or help me do this acquisition, whatever, right? That's what we're typically that's when companies will brag about who's on their board, of saying, this guy's on the board and he's led so-and-so, right? One of the main scholars in this area, Don Hambrick's, actually argued that's completely backwards, that we should be looking at our board as if they're policemen, not people to help us. And you never talk about a police force as how much value it adds to society, right? Whenever man, our police force is bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, ever. It's more like they're stopping bad things from happening. So the emphasis is wrong, in my opinion. And one of the first things and easiest things you can do is put a lawyer on your board and give that person the entire job is monitor, right? In some research that I've done myself, we found that when you put a lawyer on the board, and specifically you give that lawyer power, right? It's not helpful if you don't give that lawyer power, right? If they're a lawyer and they basically have no voice, then it doesn't really matter, right? But if you give them power, so maybe they're the chairman, the best thing, this would be hard to do because you have to have a lawyer who also is a financial expert. But the absolute best outcome is get the lawyer to be the chairman of the audit committee, which their entire job is to work with the audit. That has the absolute best outcomes. In my research, we find deception drops about 40 to 50% by just doing that alone. Putting a lawyer on the board, giving them power, that CEO deception decreases a ton. Because when they're, just when they're in the board meetings alone, that person's will talk about ethics, or if there's an ethical question will come up, they'll talk about the law, they'll talk about ethics. Whereas if they're not there, it's easy for a company to go the wrong direction. And so you need someone there to be basically the voice of ethics on your board. And too often that's not the case, and that doesn't happen because our focus is mainly on what board members provide value. And in reality, if we're talking about protecting shareholders' interests, then it should also be equally important as, let's make sure that our company doesn't go in the wrong direction. Let's make sure our company doesn't engage in fraud or doesn't engage in these things. And so really one of these absolute simplest things you can do, put a lawyer on your board. Harder thing to do that's equally important is get someone you can trust who will tell you no, right? Get someone who will be your policeman, essentially, who say, don't do that, right? That will hold the reins. So those are some things that I would recommend doing. But yeah, hopefully that helps. There's a lot I could go down. But I thought
that's cool. We're good so far. We do have a question in the chat from Elio, and Elio, I hope I'm not totally goofing up your name. But how? Now I have to find what's the percentage of unicorns that have been outright scams? So while I let our panelists talk about it, oh, thank you very much. My answer would be very, very few. And that's why they get documentaries made about them, because the outright scams are so fascinating and so intriguing that producers want to spend money making movies, and we're going to watch it. I think the number of ones that are not totally legit could be a whole bunch higher. So, and especially when you get into valuations, we get into multipliers. I was working in the high tech, in the .com bubble. So the valuations were like multipliers were like 10 times revenue and 15 times and this and that. And it was ludicrous. So if you make your math and you use big numbers and you multiply things, you can get to pretty high valuations pretty quickly and say that you're a unicorn. However, I'd love to hear from Jessica and Ian, if you have any insights on that. How do you feel about if a company says we're a unicorn? Do you go, oh, way to go? Or do you go, uh-huh?
Go ahead, Ian.
Okay, so I've never been involved with a company that says it's a unicorn, just to be clear. I do think that, and I'd be curious how Jess feels about this, and I don't know if this exactly answers the question, but I've mostly spent my time in the SaaS world, technology world. I feel like more often than not, when potential investors are evaluating what the valuation of that company could be, it tends to be looking at future potential as opposed to what's happening right now. Not that there's not clues around what's happening today. Like there's all sorts of stuff you can look at, like net dollar returns and sales efficiencies and all sorts of things that would influence how you feel about like a multiplier on a valuation, right? Like for us, we look at things like contract values. We look at partnership contracts and what they might be worth in the future, things like that. But I do think that tends to drive the valuations up a bit overall when you look at, especially in the technology sector. I think for the most part, investors do a good job of evaluating what a company may be worth. I really do think, though, there's definitely an element of opinion in there when they're doing that. So, but I agree with you. I haven't seen a lot of unicorns in general. Like 90% of them are being, evaluated incorrectly. I don't think that's happening, personally. I know, Jess, you might disagree with that.
I think it's interesting because I think we have a little bit of an epidemic right now of like these companies going public that aren't even cash flow positive. So it's kind of this, it's like we kind of have these really good experiences in these companies on one hand, and then these crazy ones on another hand, it's like, what's happening, and I love the question, how many are scams? I really don't think, like you said, there are very many. I think you've got, if you look at Adam Newman and Elizabeth Holmes and Trevor Milton, he was of Nikola. I think there's just some big ones like that are just like outright and just outrageous. And when the lid pops off, you realize it is a disaster. And so all of Stephen's points are right on, right? Really get a good board, really get investors that are going to help challenge you and take you to the next level. And there's so many things we could go into on that, that you start thinking, I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts on that one. Go ahead, Karen, though. Keep hitting.
I think, Jessica, keep going. Pick out one that you think or let's say a news item came out and talked about the next unicorn. And I'm really putting you on the spot, and I apologize for this, and anybody can answer. But what would you be reading for that would make you go, oh, this sounds pretty good? Cash positive does help. Earning revenue is a really good thing, What are some other elements? I am being so facetious because a small business, you can't survive without cash. It's like only these massive things can you survive without making money.
Yeah, and we have some locally, like in the last few years that have become a unicorn. And so I think, when I look at this, I think, especially if you're hitting a new market and you're a new product in a new market, there's huge upside to like capturing all this, like you're breaking into this. And I think there's a lot of upside there. If you were to come and say there's a new unicorn, I think there's a few things that I would look at right off the bat, and I would just evaluate the team. I always, in any startup at any investor level, you're going to look at the team, the traction, the tech, and the opportunity. Those are like my 4 areas for every investor. And so you're going to be like, everything is about the team. I mean, like 50% of the decision will probably be about the team. How solid are they? How good are they? How well do they balance each other out and have the expertise in that executive suite? So that's one of the first things I would look at, and then start doing comps and start doing research. And then eventually you dig a little deeper, right? And you go internally and see how they're doing really. But I think it's an opportunity is the next thing, right? So once you find the team that's right, then you look at the opportunity. I think you can have a killer opportunity, but if the team's not right, I mean, you'll hear Ben Horowitz and Mark Andreessen say this all the time. If the team's not right, then, we got a problem. It doesn't matter how great the opportunity is. So.
Elio, you have another question, and I'm going to read it, but I'm not sure I totally understand it. However, maybe others will. Is anyone evaluating the cybersecurity posture? And I think you're talking about kind of like Adam Newman said they were a software company or a high-tech company. And it's like, no, dude, you're leasing offices. There's nothing really high-tech about it. Go for it. Elio, jump in and ask it. That's probably better than me trying to read it.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. So yeah, I asked this at a Startup AZ event here in Arizona, and we're seeing an exponential growth in cybersecurity, and you guys are talking about billions. We're seeing projections $6 to $10 trillion in cybersecurity losses over the next few years. Trillions. Like, it's become its own economy, and everything in cyber is actually, it's a full-on business. They have HR, they're structured just like businesses. So when you look at the value of a company, everyone's been paying fast and loose. Like, I think it's become prudent a while ago to look at how much money could they lose, both in terms of a ransomware incident and also in terms of broader impacts to society. Like, you can actually, supply chain attacks like SolarWinds, you can not only lose like everything you have, you can wipe out insane amounts of value across all of society as we start connecting everything. So is this being taken into account in valuations?
Well, just look at the pipeline this week, right?
Yeah.
It's a risk. It's a risk element, I assume, is what we're talking about. You were kind of alluding to the risks, Jessica and Ian as well, of valuations, like what's the size of the market, how good is the team? And I assume another one would be, if you're talking about tech, how secure is your tech? How confident are you that A, your tech will work, and B, nobody else can
Well, I
Bubble.
love this question because I don't think people value it as much. I think it's this new thing that's hitting because everyone's realizing this is a huge liability and risk factor, you know, and there are tons of startups. I've got some dear friends at Allegis Capital that invest exclusively in cybersecurity. And I wish they were here to answer this right now because they are so hyper focused on it. And we have the Idaho National Lab here, which is doing all of that cybersecurity for our electric grids across the entire US. And they have flyouts if the threats become high enough, right? Like, so there's a lot of this that is really hot. And even if we look at WeWork, like they were taking people's driver's license and credit card numbers of their tenants. So look at that alone on the cybersecurity, right? And so you think every company, and they weren't even very high tech, right? Like they kept saying they were, but we were all like, where is the tech? But like every company needs to be very careful. In fact, I think, if there were any lawyers here, they would probably agree that pull back on any data that you're collecting from your customers as well. If you don't need it, don't get it and ask for it because you are just going to become a liability and an issue, a potential risk factor.
So
I think for SaaS organizations that mature to a certain level, right? They're going to be very aware of cybersecurity, you know, and I do think it's a people issue, kind of like Jess is talking about. Do you have the right leader in place to ensure that your company is being protected in the right way? Do you have all the right certifications in place? Are you HIPAA compliant? Are you PCI compliant? You know, those kinds of things should come into an evaluation, in my opinion. And if the company hasn't achieved those things, that's a red flag. You know, and you know, Verified First itself it happens to be a background screening company. I also think that comes into play because your biggest asset is your people, and in some ways, your biggest risk are your people. So that is something I think more and more should be paid attention to. I do think in the SaaS world, I don't know. I think that is part of the evaluation. There's some pretty easy things to uncover to know if that organization is protecting their data.
and just to be specific, SaaS software as a service.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Probably many of you know that if you are paying for any kind of software on a monthly nature, the company has a SaaS business model versus way back when we used to go to the store and we used to pick up the box and it had a CD in it and we paid for it at the cash and we brought it home and we used it. Those were the days. It's a very different world. One thing that I'll be curious about, since we've kind of hung this soft left on the cybersecurity, the valuations of cybersecurity companies. I would assume that their multipliers are going to be higher than some of the other companies, just because their capabilities are going to be, their potential is so massive. Are we going to see any risky behavior with investing in cybersecurity companies, do you think? Has it happened already? Anyone want to touch on
I
it?
think anytime there is excitement, anytime there is a fear of missing out, you're going to see people. The technical term is motivated blindness. So motivated blindness is a phenomenon in which if you have an incentive to not look, you won't look, essentially. So like think Barry Bonds, right? He was clearly taking steroids. His hat size was growing. I'm sorry, no one in their 40s no one's head grows, right? Like that doesn't happen. So this was like an obvious sign that he was engaging in steroids, but no one wanted to look, right? No one, it's motivated blindness. They didn't have an incentive to look, and so they didn't want to look because there's every time he hit it out of the park, they're getting more and more people coming in. We see the same thing with auditors, right? So if it's their first time working with a company, they're going to miss almost everything, right? And that's what we find in our research. If it's the first time they've audited a company, they'll miss like almost all the problems, because what's their motivated blindness? Well, they want this customer.
Keep the contract.
If they tell them, hey, you're committing fraud in the first day, they'll probably lose them, right? So like so there's motivated blindness across all of it, right? So yeah, I'm sure that we're going to see some crazy valuations in cybersecurity firms because that's where the incentive is. And so there's going to be motivated blindness.
It sounds like a good recipe for how to get away with fraudulent behavior is change your auditors, though it's probably a bit of a red flag as well.
Well, I think cyber's the future, right? And so we're looking at everything from company security and customer security to international security. And I just think you're seeing, the government putting together new committees on this, and it's hot because it's the future, is keeping it safe.
I also lived through the Y2K bubble. So there's just this is a little bit less paranoia and more reality, thankfully.
I'm in crypto, I'll tell you, it's there. it's
a whole different one.
You're telling me that there's a crypto bubble? Really? Like, really?
I think
yesterday, don't look. It's all on sale right now.
I would say there's a fine line between vision, BS, and fraud, right? And there are CEOs who, like Adam Newman, who are charismatic, who can sell a story and get people to buy it, right? And guys like that, unfortunately, sometimes they can get access to cheap capital, and through their sheer charisma, get people to buy into a lie, get people to buy into this vision, and that's what we see with Adam Newman. That's what we see with Theranos. It's these people who are very charismatic, and we want to buy into that vision. We want to buy into this wonderful story they've told. I mean, even Bezos, who's legit, right? He's done great work and he's not a fraud at all. But if you listen to him talk about his company, or you get some of the old videos of him talking about it, you're ready to put all your money into a stock. You're like, take all my money, right? Thankfully, it was a good company and real. But like I said, there's a fine line between vision, BS, and fraud. And that's the hard part, right?
Well, and that's a hot topic, right? If you're going to talk about the charismatic leader, is it good or bad, right? And so you go into all these things of like, it can have a dark side, and there's a dark side of a dark triad of personality traits of the narcissist, Machiavellian, and the psychopathy on people. And I think every CEO has this little level. We probably all have this little level of narcissism in us, right? But when you mix that unbridled narcissism with the motivated blindness, holy cats, right? Like you're just going to have a hot mess going on in there. And I just think that it's a hot topic, and if you look at like Jim Collins' Good to Great, I think that's a book on everyone's shelf that needs to be there. And if you look at Adam Grant, who's preaching this as well, I think you've got this humility aspect that I am really big on. If the CEO is about me, I think we've all worked with people that we can probably see a little bit of Adam Newman in, where you can just be like, yeah, I've been around people like that. And then I think what you can do is look and be like, okay, who do I want to work for next? And be really careful in particular about what's their why, and why are they really doing this? And how much of it, when you start to dig into this paperwork and you see how much Adam was selfishly taking, there was no we, in this story, it was all me, right? It was all like me. And I think that's what you have to be really careful of as an investor and as an employee working for a startup. And you have to self-check yourself if you're doing a startup too, right? Like, what are my real fundamental motivations on why am I doing this? And making sure that you do have that humility in there, that you can not only recognize your traits, but you'll work on them and just own them, and then have the integrity. I'm really big on values, and having that integrity is just crucial.
Yeah, I want to point out, like, I don't think on its own narcissism is a bad thing. Like, and there are definitely dynamic leaders out there like Bezos, but the thing about Bezos is, behind all that, he has a plan that he's executed on, that makes sense, makes a lot of money, has caused a ton of growth. Adam Newman didn't have that. And why nobody caught that is the mystery to me, because it feels like it's fairly obvious. He didn't really have a way of growing the business in a way that it didn't seem like it was sustainable to me. But I think you've got to have a little bit of an ego to launch a company. And I love the idea of a humble narcissist for sure. Like those are the guys that tend to do the best because they also recognize their flaws. They actually know they're a narcissist, right? They recognize it's a strength, but also a weakness. I don't think Adam knew that.
Well,
Yeah,
and
Not-
maybe the
not
cause-
only-
Oh yeah, go ahead, Stephen.
Not only did he not know it, he also had no one around him to tell him it, right? And
No-
so like, yeah, I agree with you that definitely you need some level of ego and some level of narcissism to start a company for sure. But if you
Right.
don't have someone to pull your reins back, that's the problem, right? And so, and then he bought his own medicine, you know, he drank his own Kool-Aid, bought it, and then he had no one to like wake him up.
Yeah, it's not like all his ideas were wrong either, right? Like his concepts, some of them were pretty solid. Like I really do like what he says about social networking pulling us apart and creating the silos in our community that are creating all this conflict. And he wanted to solve for that, right? He talks to going from the I to the we, right? From iPhone to WeWork. But I think he's right. That is a problem and it needs to be fixed. And I think there was some honesty there that he was really trying to fix it, but he's so carried away with himself that, you know, on an executable level, he wasn't going to be the one to do it.
we have a couple comments in the chat. One from Mary makes her want to learn more about the psychology of trust. Yes, that is very interesting, how to develop trust and lose it. And I'm pretty sure in our OB class, organizational behavior, there's quite a long trust literature that's talks about the different kinds of trust issues and how trust can or cannot be repaired. So lots of good readings out there. From Catherine, I'd love to hear Stephen's thought on trust versus organizational identification. So org identity?
The difference between those, or just talk about those in general, how this applies? What's the?
Catherine just said yes.
Okay, so
yes. So the relationship and how they apply, because I think what the organizational identity or identification within WeWork may have appeared as trust within the organization, but clearly wasn't in the way that the employees were treated or misled.
Yeah, so okay, so trying to like get my thoughts together because there's a lot I can go down. There's a lot of avenues. So I mean, one of my main research areas is deception, and so a big part of that is absolutely trust. So just a quick on that is I would say that we're kind of actually evolutionary designed to be trustworthy, right? So one of the reasons why we're actually terrible at detecting deception, and anyone who thinks they're good at detecting deception, you're wrong. Studies have shown that we're bad at it. And it's because we tend to be trustworthy. We generally trust everyone, and we assume that most people are being honest with us, and most of the time we're actually right. Most of the time that's accurate. So what we see within organizational identification literature, so that's like how much you identify with the firm, how much that your identity is wrapped up in that area. So the more you identify with the firm, the more you're actually willing to engage in unethical behaviors for the benefit of the firm. And then if we look at companies like WeWork or some of these Silicon Valley companies, that's really what they focus on a lot on, is helping that person have a higher level of organizational identification, which there's good aspects of it. There's so many good aspects. The more you identify with the firm, the more you work for it, the more sticky you are for the company, so you're not going to leave, right? There's huge benefits for having a high organization identification within your employees. But the downside is that it can lead to a lot of unethical behaviors, particularly or especially when it's really competitive. So if you're in a very competitive market and you strongly identify with your firm, you're far more likely to engage in unethical behavior. And that becomes even more likely if you have a CEO or your top management team who's a little loosey-goosey with their ethics, right? So like when we like Enron, that's a top management team, very loosey-goosey with their ethics. It went all the way down throughout the whole organization. So organizational identification in itself isn't bad, but again, you need to have checks to make sure that it doesn't lead to really bad outcomes like what we see with WeWork. So that would be my thoughts there. I'm not sure how much more Catherine would want me to go down that road, but that would be my quick 2 cents on that.
Wouldn't you say though with Enron, the difference, that the problem there was, I didn't feel like with Enron there was transparency all the way down to the bottom level.
Sure. I just was saying,
there was a lot of uncertainty about why things were happening at the top level, and those employees knew nothing about it. They had no information about why these things were occurring within their organization.
Sure, but I would still say that the unethical practices at the top went down throughout the whole organization. Or if I want, let's go to Wells Fargo, right? It's the unethics at the very top of the organization went all the way down throughout the organization, and then they have these insane quotas they're trying to make, which they can't possibly make, right? And it's the unethics at the top of the organization, it bleeds down. And so if you want to make sure that your corporation stays ethically sound, everyone at top has to be can't be hypocrites. They all have to be good. They all have to be following whatever values you are aspiring to, because people follow the leader. They will absolutely will.
Right. I feel like the way you battle that is making sure you have a why for everything you're doing, and you're being transparent about it, and you're explaining that all the way down to the ground floor, so everyone knows why you're doing what you're doing, and they believe that why is honest.
Yeah.
So if you do that, I think you build a trust within the organization completely. You have the right kind of culture in place. You have the right kind of commitment in place. And everybody feels positive about what they're doing.
Yeah, well, and you can that organizational identification, you can have those values that are ethics or that's honesty and so forth be built in within the values of the organization. And so then ideally, the more they identify with the firm, they also identify with those values, and that should prevent them from to engage in some of those bad sides, some of the dark side of organizational identification.
Okay,
ideally.
guys, I've got a great question from Mary. Thank you, Mary. Do any of you, or we, have suggestions for people who work at organizations like this, and how to address it on a resume or in a job search? So yeah, I worked at Enron for 2 years, and I left because, or I grew up with Anderson Consulting, and all of a sudden they were no longer. And before, if you had Anderson Consulting on your resume, I'm sure you easily made an extra 30 grand a year just because you had that in your work history. All of a sudden, you're unethical. Thoughts, suggestions? That's just I hadn't thought of that specific challenge. And then we're going to move on to zombies. So I'm going to try and keep this a little tiny bit short if possible.
I'm the wrong scholar for that question.
Yeah, I know, we're both macro. So just to let you know, just to explain our terminology, Stephen and I both tend to analyze and examine firms, and CEOs are kind of even at the firm level because they represent the firm. And this question is a real HR, human resources, organizational behavior question. So Ian or Jessica, do you have any thoughts if you saw a resume with someone who worked at WeWork, Enron?
I think I'd be straight up, and if I interviewed that person, I don't think I would block them out, and but I would definitely ask about it in my interview as a company hiring somebody that came from somewhere like that, that it's like, okay, so what's your take on this? I mean, I would just be so straight up and have a really solid answer that is deep with your integrity line, like, this is why I left, or, hey, there were some issues there that we were blinded by. I mean, I think you can be very honest and people understand, because we've been around those companies and people.
So,
I'm not sure I
was the CEO. So Ian, go ahead.
I'm not sure. I think it depends on the level that you're at within those organizations that, have had these problems. I'm not sure I would judge anybody like, you know, the rank and file employee who's applying for another job on the fact that they work for Enron, I would probably feel some sympathy for them overall, you know, to be honest. And I'm not going to evaluate them based on that. I'm going to evaluate them based on a whole bunch of other things that have nothing to do with any, you know, what that company did. Now, on the other hand, if they're higher up in the organization and they're, you know, like implicit in that activity, that's a whole nother story. That's different altogether.
Yeah. Yes. So where were you? What level of your own ethics did you have to deal with or respond to in that job? And then how will it move forward? That was my relatively weak attempt to wrap up. So the next topic that we have, and we have to address it because it was in our title, are zombie companies. So the fun part was going from a unicorn to a zombie. So a zombie, by definition, is making enough money to keep its doors open and pay off the interest on its debt. So we could look at this in a personal way. If you're only paying off the interest on your credit cards and you can pay the rent and put food on the table, that's not exactly where you want to be. You want to be paying off principal and getting ahead and maybe actually having some savings. So zombie companies, we have quite a few of them, especially since COVID, because it kind of helped create some, i.e. most of our airlines. Now we've got a distinction between zombies that are really the walking dead and the walking wounded. From your perspectives, if any of you have one, panelists, how do you feel about the designation of a company being called a zombie? Kind of like being called a unicorn. It's like, yeah, is that legit or is it not legit? And do you feel that companies can, I don't want to use that term, but come back to life?
I think it's hard to come back to life. So you got to be really innovative, and you got to innovate within that company. Ian, sorry.
No, that's fine. I'm just thinking of your examples of airlines, you know. See, this is where I don't like labels, right? I tell my kids all the time, don't let anyone label you, because that's not cool. And I think these labels that we're using, I don't know if I would label an airline as a zombie company. They have a business plan. They've been hit by a temporary change in the market, but they're viable. They serve a purpose. They have they're still operating, and you know, you look at what's happening even just this month. You can see that, you know, ticket prices are going up, and flights are increasing, and everything else. So like, I would hesitate to label a company a zombie when they, in those circumstances, right? To me, that's not a zombie. That's just a company dealing with a tough issue.
Good. I've had a request that we, to wrap it up, we spent a lot more time talking about unicorns and zombies. So maybe we'll have to bring back, they're just fun. They're zombies, you know, we can get some good mileage out of these terms. Ian, thank you very much. I think that's your final thought there was one of the key messages. Watch out for labels. Watch out for any labels. People jumping on bandwagons, whether they're good bandwagons, theoretically good, i.e. WeWork or cryptocurrency, or oh, come on, the GameStop. That was the one I was trying to come up. The GameStop, that was last month's or last spring's, but watch out for these bandwagons, both good and bad. And make sure you work for a company that is willing to hear bad news or negative thoughts. Would that be another wrap up? Do any of you want to jump in? And too good to be true companies. Thank you, Jenny. That's a great way to phrase it. Avoid or be wary of the too good to be true companies. Panelists, would you like to jump in with anything? We hand it over to Tim.
I think this was a great discussion. Thank you for having us. And I think the big thing is right now there's a trend of move fast and break things all over Silicon Valley. And I think there's a downside to moving fast and breaking things. There's a good side to hustle. There's a really bad side to hustling. And just make sure that you have your integrity in line and where your ethical compass is, because we need more of that in business.
Awesome.
Yeah, I totally agree. As an entrepreneur, I think that's the biggest struggle. Making sure your integrity is intact and you're not looking for fast overnight solutions to solve your problems. Those rarely work, and typically there's a lack of integrity there when you're doing that. I've encountered a lot of entrepreneurs like that, and I think also as an entrepreneur, make sure you're open to feedback. Make sure you're building a team around you. When you get in the room with your team, if there's no disagreement, that's a problem. So encourage it.
Way to go. Stephen, last words?
Yeah, so I would say that it doesn't really pay to be unethical. You'll eventually get caught, right? At some point, you'll eventually be found out. You can't be a fraud forever, and you can't keep it up forever. So eventually, it's going to come back and bite you. So don't take those shortcuts, and be careful. And also, like, be careful who you take money from. When you're taking money, you're essentially kind of getting into marriage. And so pick investors who will actually help you. Pick investors who will give you good advice, who won't just be like, all right, here's millions of dollars, go for it, right? Like, be wise, be picky in who you choose, because that person is that matters. So that's what I would say. So be picky who you choose, and if you do decide to be unethical, you'll probably eventually get caught. So it's not worth it.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much, audience, of course, for being here and joining us today. And then, of course, I want to thank our panel, Stephen, Karen, Ian, Jess. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing some of your expertise. Since I get to close things, I have to put in a little shameless plug for some of our programs here. I want to mention our business creation certificate, which is launching this next semester in the fall. We're really excited for our first cohort of students. This particular certificate is designed to help emerging entrepreneurs launch products and companies. Do we want you to start the next unicorn? Yes, but we want to teach you how to do it through responsible sales marketing and partner management. We want to give you the tools to see things from a CRO's point of view and really help you pursue venture capital and increase valuation in an ethical way. We've got a few other certificates. There's Plus Business, which is great for those of you who already have businesses running. And if you're looking for a straight up completion of a bachelor's degree, we've got a fantastic online BBA management program, and even some connections we made today with cybersecurity. We have an undergraduate program in cyber, and also a graduate, and some certificates too. So if any of that's exciting to you, I think we have some contact info maybe on the next slide, or we can certainly share that out to the guest list. Oh, there it is. So yeah, jot this stuff down. I'm always around at Boise State, and I'd be happy to talk with you about any of those programs. I think that's it. Thank you, everyone.
Woohoo! Thank you very much. We need the applause meter. Thank you, panelists, very much, and audience for the great questions. That's awesome.
Thank you.
That was a great audience question. Thanks. That was fun.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. That was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.